So the talk I'm going to give tonight deals with two publications ago, although my current publication, I just got something from the publishers, they're still working on it. So I guess this is my most recent publication in print. The larger auspice of the project itself deals with looking at camp after Susan Sontag's essay. Sontag's position is basically that camp's not political. I remember even as an undergraduate having a lot of trouble with this concept, as I always understood my own camp as socio-political, either a pushing of a button or a desire to create some kind of change. So my focal point for the essay I asked you to read deals with camp androgyny, and in particular, the year 1990, and the kinds of representational images that really surfaced and manifested throughout that year. I've called it the post-gendered spaces of Vogue because gender, as we understand it, actually has the ability to transgress the delineated boundaries that we set up through the different examples that I look at within this essay, all culminating in the late 80s to the year 1990. I open up the essay by looking at the musical changes that shifted in the 80s. We had talked about this just before I had shared with you information rather condensed about the AIDS pandemic. And the way that I think we had in response to some of the films we've screened, this golden age of UK films that brought a breath of hope even to the AIDS years. But by 1989, by the notions of safe sex, by the lobbying and the political activism, and the desire to help people, who are suffering, to shift the darkness of AIDS, 1989 and 1990 in this study remain integral for me because of the images that really surfaced. And the dominant image of the male that really, in many ways, dominates gay culture and subculture was seriously questioned for a moment in time in a great way by androgynous young women who were understood as the supermodels, the discovery of the secret drag houses of New York, and believe it or not, Madonna. So how did all of these rather conflictual spaces come together? My suggestion is through camp, that camp, as we structure visuals, films, text, dialogue, allows us to laugh at and question the kinds of subjectivity we could be examining. I also make a suggestion in this essay early on that what I'm going to look at in response to Vogue subculture was appropriated by Madonna in 1990, and that camp, which was once a secret code, and it played a very active role in the way the reader, right, either visual or linguistically, could decode a particular cult following, was kind of pushed into the mainstream in the way that Madonna appropriated Vogue. And this is something I only, come back to at the end of the essay because there's more ideas I really want to deal with. Page 5 of my essay. So I don't think those are the page numbers you have. It's on the PDF that I'm looking at, but I'll get you a page number. The third page of the essay opens up notes on camp and the way that Sontag does imply that camp embraces a form of modernism, and that much it does for sure. And my contribution to that discussion is that androgyny pushes the limits of modernism. And all of a sudden, what might have been girlish or boyish becomes both, or more than both, as it could also move into spaces of possible trans or drag representations. The images on page 206 of my essay that showed us this kind of androgyny, and a camp androgyny in particular, was started by Madonna. She went from kind of being just, more of a club kid with kind of big hair to cutting her hair short, bleaching it for the probably not the first time, and being exceptionally athletic. So her images that she presented were of a young woman who had an athletic body she was proud of. And I draw students' attention to the Papa Don't Preach video, where she has two visions of herself with the short bleached out hair. One, it's sort of forward and again in, and she's usually dressed in a t-shirt and jeans, right? Very androgynously. And another where it's kind of all done up and she's in a bustier dancing around us, right? She kind of did during that period of time. I think on some level, and it's hard sometimes understanding Madonna now, poor thing, that Madonna very often, for quite a decent period of time, presented this avenue from which we could influence the kinds of cultural productions that would follow. And what happened after was this very interesting moment in time where all of a sudden, the same way Madonna or any musical artist or celebrity would be a household name, two young women in particular became who we understand as the supermodels, and they started to become household names. Linda Evangelista, who's actually Canadian, and Christy Turlington, who's Californian, were up and coming by the year 1989. And at a photo shoot, Jean Dupre saw Linda, he was a stylist, Linda Evangelista in a short-haired wig. And she had quite, thick, maney, that kind of late 80s hair like we see in Pretty Woman, but not quite as long. And he chopped her hair off. And you can Google search it and you'll see the images of the haircut, like she's holding her face as Jean has the like the ponytail in his hand. She found herself on the cover of every single magazine, doing major fashion shoots after that, and influenced the representation of young women during that period of time. She was frequently styled androgynously. Sure, we might have seen some hints to a very pretty Liza Minnelli in Cabaret, or the Beatles, which is probably more apt. She kind of had a Beatles haircut. And she started an entire fashion trend that affected not only the fashion industry, but the college kids who would copy the looks that they saw, because the looks were socio-political. If we can think about what I understand as queer creativity and queer art, Linda's look was this. Gay and lesbian friends would go and get their haircut like her. And influenced by Linda the same way was her partner in crime, her best friend, Christy Turlington, who did the same thing the year later. This gender play, this not boy, not girl, not male, not female, doesn't have to be, it's just beautiful, really caused a wave where people began to feel liberated. In other words, nobody needed to understand themselves for a brief moment in time in response to reductive biology, for a lack of definition. And the crisis of the age began to shift. It was safe to date, or safer. There were safer activities where being gay wasn't understood in response to getting very, very ill, and generally terminally ill. What was happening during this period of time as well is the semiotic that would bring play and gender together to question sexuality, right? A lot of these images were staged in a particular way where we would look at an image of Christie or Linda and be, boy, girl, who am I looking at? During the same period of time, in response to racialized spaces, the drag houses of New York became a secret currency, and only those privy to what was going on in Harlem during or by the late 1980s knew of this. Linda's first ad was her famous white shirt ad. And this really set the stage for these blurred images that the Demi Moore would copy for this it girl haircut. And if we think about the drag houses lurking underneath, right, where, and it wasn't just African-American, it was also, I don't know if this term is used anymore, but they understood themselves as Latino or Latina. In other words, a mixture of both Black and Latin backgrounds, had this secret society where they would Vogue and have dance-offs. And they represented themselves in different houses that I'll get to as well. And this provided a release from the standardization of white gay culture. There's a difference that existed in the ways that these supermodels represented themselves, a difference as well within the practices that happened in the drag houses of New York. If we think of Derrida's reading of difference, Derrida argues that difference is announced in a movement of différance, and movement is important because différance exists between speech and writing. And this is what we talk about quite a bit when we think of Derrida and of course Jacques Lacan on langue and parole, that there's what's written down, right? I'd like a young woman in short hair and a white shirt and faded jeans, gentle with the makeup, I'd like to show her face. That might be the writing. But what happens with the visual speech in this case, with the image? And my arguments here are that the images began to challenge male-female, very oftentimes Black and white, and most certainly straight, gay, and trans. In other words, what were delineated might have had a chance to kind of mesh together a little more. If you need some background before Linda and Christie got out there with their very androgynous image, the kinds of images we saw in advertising were basically, you know, those Calvin Klein images, right? The famous, what's the Olympic sport called where they, javelin thrower, there we go, who did an underwear ad, or Marky Mark. And these were very clean cut, cloned, muscled, waxed, ironic images of maleness. All of a sudden, the masculine intersected a space where androgyny overrode it. And in many ways, I think the creative consulting behind Linda's shearing and later Christie's was motivated in part by Madonna's earlier look. How does cultural production shape how we understand what we see? Think about how we gather information when we're at university, how we read texts. We might read literature, we might read films, we might read advertising. So if we're looking, and back then we read music videos quite a bit too, if we're looking at visuals, having Linda and Christie and a number of other models did it too, they were just famous, create these androgynous images of absolutely gorgeous young women who were not embracing any articulated, steadfast, or reductive image of femininity. But instead, there was a particular gaze to the way the camera would shoot them. And we didn't know if this was just kind of like a very young woman, so not yet into her womanhood, which of course they were already 18, 19, so they were, or were the poses being struck a camping young man? I think these images are a kind of defiance. And it's this defiance that attempted to question the sadness associated with the years prior. By using female models as subjects, you can think about the Shakespearean stage and the way that on the Shakespearean stage, roles by men were actually played by, roles by women, forgive me, were played by younger men. So there is a political gesture in choosing a gender sometime. And these women functioned as a kind of voice for a way to read between symbol and allegory, to quote Paul de Man, and to find a new kind of image that really pushed other kinds of images out of the way. I explain the way on 209 and 210, the way that this also affected men's hairstyles of the time, which were very structured, all of a sudden became very playful, and young men, regardless of sexuality, embraced a more boyish look, the same way young women did. And then what started in the 90s began what would end up with silence equals death, and a way of silencing AIDS through safety, through government pressures, and ways of liberating ourselves through a visual aesthetic. At the same time, if we're thinking about, more mainstream white or whiter culture, the House of Extravaganza existed since 1982, and there were a series of houses that existed in this secret society of Latino and Latina culture. La Beja, Magnifique, Saint Laurent, Omni, Ebony, Dupree. These homes had young people there who were part of these lives and who used dance as a way to almost filter out their leftover energy from the realities of mainstream gay and queer cultural life. No one really knew of these houses, but Malcolm McLaren, a British musician, discovered them. And the year before Madonna released her once B-side, Vogue, which, she was already megastardom, that just kind of amplified megastardom. McLaren released Deep in Vogue. And it's from this single that Madonna most probably knew in part, but her dancers were probably affiliated with the houses in New York too in some way. This secret society of dance. In the song itself, I quote lyrics that McLaren chants, and he says, I'll try and do what he sounded like. Sometimes on a legendary night, like the closing of the garage when the crowd is cooling down the spirits, listen, and you will hear all the houses that walked there before. And he outs these houses, but he lets us know that we had to listen to know they existed in New York, far north from Greenwich Village and gay bars. And in many ways, the ghosts of these subjects could be felt in his song. And I think I've posted the music video for this song as a random resource for the course if that interests you. This would have been reflected in Paris is Burning, which you may be studying in another film class, as I'm told it's in another 300 level right now, where the houses of New York embrace not androgyny, but other options to what we understand as gender delineations, where non-white men, queens, they understood themselves as transvestites. The term is antiquated now, but that's how they understood themselves of the time. There were the drag houses competed at what was understood as balls, where race, sexuality, gender, these created a release, something away from the gay mainstream, something secret that I think McLaren pays homage to in a very tactful and graceful way. In my essay, I make reference to Paris is Burning, but I think save that for Butler, right? As I lean on her quite a bit. And the point I'd like to make is that camp, as we'll certainly see in the film that we'll screen this evening, works in response to the aesthetics, that the camp aesthetic has the ability to challenge. I don't know if it does now. So maybe you can make note of that question. And that's a place I might like to open up our discussion. Does camp still do what it did do for a very long time? Or do we not understand camp in the same way? Remember too, that within the drag houses of New York, this was a secret society. You had to be part of a house. You had to be part of this subculture. But Madonna shifts the subjectivity that we see in McLaren's video. And in McLaren's video, he uses Willie Ninja, who unfortunately did pass. And he was an incredible Voguer. He's amazing to watch go. And the video doesn't show us everything, but I should have an interview with Willie Ninja as well on one of the resources. You'll be able to, and I'm, as I'm recording myself, I'm going to put down that note and make sure I do, that there is an identity away from the mainstream. Madonna's appropriation of Vogue was done without the world knowing. In other words, the secret realities of queer life, non-white queer life, were unbeknownst, presumably, to Madonna. And when she did her music video to her song, she actually ends up wrapping the names of non-white actors, generally from the 40s and 50s, or celebrities. So we certainly could understand her version of Vogue as camp, but her camp has a slapstick quality to it, which we will see with our film screening, probably not tonight by the looks of the time, but next class for sure. And think about the slapstick and the realities too of and I'm sure you've seen this a lot in different films or cultural productions, the kind of the gay minstrel, as it has been called, this kind of pejorative representation of the gay man that fits stereotypes that aren't always true. And Madonna does this with her dancers, who at least in the 2017 documentary, Not Truth or Dare, Strike a Pose. And I hope to get a chance to teach that in some course sometime. It's an amazing documentary. I love nonfiction film, just putting it out there. They were not half as sort of flamboyant as Madonna makes them appear, especially in her MTV performance of 1990, which is hilarious. And I should have it on our resources. If I don't, Brian's still making lists. I think I spend my life making lists. I send you guys lists too, right? Y'all have lists from me at the start of class sometimes. So it just kind of shows you how I work. And in her version of Vogue that she does at the MTV Music Awards, there's a kind of almost an eroticization of these non-white dancers, as well as a way of representing them within a series of gay stereotypes. Where McLaren's understanding of the drag houses of New York is layered and complex, politically aware, I might suggest it's high camp, where the low camp could be seen through the paradoxical, sometimes slapstick or even tragic images that Madonna does present. And you could think of Truth or Dare, which is another wonderful film to teach, because it unfortunately is low camp, right? It shows us her incredible talents, but there's also a weave through the film of our desire to sympathize with her because she's working so hard. Like, I think many of us would have killed to be famous like she was. So the kinds of drag houses that we see in the film Paris is Burning, and I urge you to watch it if you haven't, and Deep in Vogue in Malcolm McLaren's video shown to us just a little bit, reveal the realities and the ways that gender and race can be questioned to debunk the ways we think about them. And, you know, a note as well, I don't think Madonna's Vogue has anything to do with people of color at all. But that's the Vogue that we understand through the mainstream. Judith Butler has an interesting position on Paris is Burning, and she suggests that the film reflects a repetition of law into hyperbole. And that's something I also want you to think about in our screening tonight. Sorry, think about one's status as a simple performative. I think what Butler makes reference to is a kind of slippage in representation. And what happens, as I looked at with the supermodels, with Malcolm McLaren, with the drag houses in New York, is there's a consequential disobedience in Butlerian terms. And this is really the only way that we can challenge the way that gender and sexuality are constructed. We must be disobedient at the performances that we present as professor, as student, as actor, as drag queen, as voguer, as whatever. They can have socio-political ramifications, and it's through these that society begins to turn. I draw your attention on 212 to the differences between Laverne Cox, Fallon Fox, and Caitlyn Jenner. And I ask you to think about the differences with these people and the way that they actually are not all politicized in the same way. So the subjects from our Vogue houses don't really liberate unless we can read their liberation, sadly, spiritually. But McLaren's video honors the lives that these non-white, non-mainstream queer men embraced. They ask us to ask questions about race and queerness. And I urge you through the screening that we see this evening to really question the images of queer identity and race in one part as well, possibly two. I think I'm going to wrap up this recorded lecture now, and I'm going to make reference to the way that spaces of dance and our representations of sexuality are really indeterminate. In other words, they're part of our creative palette. That how do we get to our essays? How do we get to our films? How do we get to our artwork? How do we get to the production that changes the queer social world in the way we want it to? I remember when I wrote this essay, I had the necessary music playing behind me, and I frequently would take dancing breaks. So the creativity and the way to engage with the kinds of images we see will result in fluidity, so that our arguments can actually have some kind of politicized sustenance. Foucault understands that society is fixated on the legitimacy of sexual construction. And think about that. So as we produce queer works of art, we actually have a chance to debunk some of these constructions. So I'll end this recorded lecture now, and we can hopefully go to a question period.